So I have resumed the recording, and then I am going to go ahead and kick off the workshop here. Okay, and now we had this problem last time with gray boxes, and I think that we finally figured out how to get rid of the gray boxes. So hopefully we won't have any gray box problem happening. But tonight's topic is all about rain gardens. And this beautiful overflowing rain garden that you see here is one that was built in Matamidi probably 12 or 13 years ago. So we've been building rain gardens in Washington County for about 15 years now. I started in 2006, and when I started, it was about 3 weeks after the Conservation District staff had, oh, I see. So the gray boxes are going to pop up every time new people come in. Huh. Okay. So the Conservation District staff had just built demonstration rain gardens at the Washington County Fairgrounds. And I think there was 1 or 2 residential rain gardens in the county. And then we've really just gone to town promoting and helping people to build rain gardens. And there are now, well over 1,500 rain gardens in Washington County. And a lot of them are just going in as part of natural development, as development is happening, or as cities are doing road projects. Okay, let's see, here we go. So I'm going to start our workshop talking about the whys of why to plant a rain garden. I'll turn things over to Brett, the landscape architect, to talk about all of the design, the design, where to put your rain garden, plant selection, installation. And then Cameron is our maintenance expert. And then at the very end, I'll come back and fill in with some of the resources and funding that may be of help to you. Okay, so 40% of Minnesota lakes, rivers, and streams are impaired. And in fact, they recently updated the statistic that is more like 56% of Minnesota lakes, rivers, and streams are impaired. And there's a variety of reasons. The most common impairment is mercury, due to atmospheric deposition. This ends up in fish tissue and is the reason that we have fish consumption advisories for a lot of lakes in the state. But in our metro areas and in our southern part of the state where there's a lot of farming, we also have problems with eutrophication. And that's just a fancy word for saying too much nutrients in the water. The nutrients feed the algae, and then you end up with the lakes looking like this, green. Stormwater runoff in our urban areas is a major source of pollution. And if you see curb lines that look like this with all the leaves and the gunk on them, that all has to go someplace. And typically it's going into a storm drain, which connects to a lake or a stream, and it's carrying all that gunk and that nutrients with it. We tell people that the impacts of changing as we develop has a kind of a disproportionate impact on our water resources. So in a natural environment, only about 10% of the rain and the snow just runs off into lakes and streams. The rest of the water is either soaking down into the ground, or it's being evaporated, or it's being pulled up by the plants and the trees. And for each incremental amount of development that we have, if you have 10 to 20% impervious surface, meaning rooftops and driveways, we already end up with twice as much runoff. And you get to 35 to 50% impervious, we have 30% runoff. You get to an ultra urban setting, and there might be 55 or more % of the rain and melting snow running off. So that creates a lot of impacts for the water resources. 1 pound of phosphorus equals 500 pounds of algae. So it adds up really quickly. It might not sound a lot when we talk about a rain garden and say, oh, a typical rain garden might capture 1/10 of a pound of phosphorus, but that's 50 pounds of algae in the lake. Or if it's one of these larger curb cut rain gardens, it might be catching 1 pound of phosphorus. So 500 pounds of algae not going into the lake, or not growing in the lake. So we're calling on you all to be superheroes This is where you get to choose your adventure. And just to talk a little bit about gardening with native plants in particular, when we design rain gardens, and Brett will get more into the plant design, we very often are using native plants, although with rain gardens, we don't always exclusively use native plants. If you've come to a previous workshop where we're talking about shoreline plantings, that needs to be 100% native plants that grow in our region because it's, a wild natural environment. If you're building a rain garden that's in your front yard, it's someplace that's already surrounded by asphalt and turf, it's not as essential that we have 100% native plants. So you might think of something like in this photo where we have a mix of natives and cultivars that are all kind of happily living together. So you can get some of the habitat benefits for pollinators. And then you can also have some plants that maybe just have more color throughout the year or are a little tidier looking. Native plant communities in our area, Washington County is the kind of like long skinny one over on the right side of this image. This is looking at the 7-county metro area, what it looked like when Europeans first began migrating to this area in the late 1800s. And our region was very much oak openings and prairie, something we call oak savanna. Unfortunately, today we have very few areas where there is still natural habitat, those native plant communities remaining. There's a lot of areas that look natural to the layperson. It looks like it's woods, it looks like it's a field, but it's not. It's trees that have regrown over time. It's an old farm field that's grown up and might have a lot of weeds in it. But there's only a few areas where we have native plant communities that are, just still the same as they were in the past. A lot of them tend to be along the river areas, and then up in the northern end of the county, we've got some patches as well. So we talk about the benefits of native plants. In rain gardens, the roots of the native plants are really great because they go down very deep. They will help to soak more water into the soil, and they also hold on to the soil. Once the plant is established, they do a really good job of holding that soil in place so that it is less likely to erode. If you look on the very far side of this diagram here, it says Kentucky Bluegrass, and it's showing you that the Kentucky Bluegrass roots are only maybe 3 inches deep, whereas these native plants can have roots that are 8, 9, 10, even 12 feet deep. They can go really, really deep. The other thing that's nice about having deep-rooted plants is they don't need to be watered. They are going to be drought resistant and fairly low maintenance. And then you'll hear us talk a lot about the benefits for pollinators and other kinds of wildlife. For example, we know that the monarch butterfly can only lay eggs on milkweed plants. So we know that we need to have milkweed in order to provide habitat for them. The caterpillars, once they hatch, they look like this little yellow, black, and white striped one, and they will feed on the milkweed plant. It has a toxin in it that's poisonous to other kinds of insects, but they are not, susceptible to that toxin. But there are a couple of different kinds of milkweed. So this one is the common milkweed that you might find growing in farm fields and ditches. There's also a butterfly milkweed that grows in drier areas. It's shorter. It has these orange flowers. It's less likely to spread all over your yard the way the common milkweed does. And then there's a marsh milkweed, which, as the name implies, grows in marshy areas. And then there's all sorts of other wildlife that we are also concerned with trying to maintain habitat for. So just know that when we're talking about native gardens and rain gardens, by planting these in your yard, you can really help to maintain and sustain a lot of, birds and turtles and birds, turtles, bees, butterflies, things like that we like to see. So what is a rain garden? This is a very cheesy but effective illustration and animation. Basically, all we're talking about is carving out a hole to plant a garden in that is going to be ever so slightly bowl shaped. And you're siting it someplace where the water is flowing naturally, where it's coming off of a roof, it's coming off of a driveway, it's coming off of a road. And the whole goal is that when it rains, it's going to soak into the ground, or it's going to be evaporated. It's going to be pulled up by the plants. And basically within 24 to 48 hours, the rain garden should be dry again. So they're not water gardens. Most of the time they look like dry gardens, but they will be wet for, you know, that day or so right after it rains. So the landmark example that we most often share to explain how rain gardens are effective is from Burnsville. This project was designed back in, I want to say 2003. And what they did is took two streets that were right next to each other. And on one of the streets, they installed rain gardens, as you can see, all up and down the street in people's front yards or in that backyard swale area. And in the other street, they didn't. And then they had stormwater monitoring equipment down in the storm drains to see what kind of impact there was. So this is what the homes look like ahead of time, typical new development, suburban area, not very interesting. And this is what the rain gardens look like afterwards. And the monitoring data, what you want to look at is the green line and the red line. So in year one, before the rain gardens went in, the two neighborhoods acted exactly the same. And in year two, the control neighborhood, that's the green line, acted the same, had lots of runoff. And the steady neighborhood, where those 18 rain gardens got put in, had an 85% reduction in stormwater. So that was kind of the motivation for communities all over the Twin Cities to start incorporating rain gardens into their road work and their new developments. All right, so I am going to stop my share and I am going to turn things over to Brett, the landscape guy now.
All right. Thanks, Angie. Let me pull up the presentation here. And let's see, just go to view from, let's see, should see from previous slide here, or from current slide, or slideshow, that's right. Okay, so now you've learned all these awesome things about rain gardens and what they can do and how they can be designed. And it's a good segue into some of the key things to keep in mind when you're going to look around your property, try to identify areas where a rain garden might be both aesthetically interesting for both you and your neighbors and other people in the neighborhood, but also have it function as it's supposed to. So key things to keep in mind when you're going to evaluate your own property are to identify existing vegetation. Where do you have existing trees and shrubs and perennial beds on your property? Location of utilities, always call before you dig. It's a good rule of thumb to follow and keep in mind. You know, can you site your rain garden at least 10 feet away from the foundation of your home? That's really something really important to keep in mind, so that you're not encouraging water intrusion into your basement or into your foundation. And then also looking at property lines and easements, of course, so you're not building on your neighbor's lawn, and keeping in mind local city ordinances that might affect what you can or can't do in your yard. And also looking at how does water move in across your property, the topography and hydrology. You know, where's water collecting? Where do you have slope in your yard that can direct water to areas where you want it to go? And where's it going to end up? Is it going to end up in the street where it's going to flow down to a storm sewer? Is it going to flow down to a ditch in the backyard? Those are all really good things to keep in mind. And somewhat counterintuitively, the lowest, wettest spot in your yard isn't always going to be the right place for a rain garden. It's often good to try to collect water in those higher and drier spots and infiltrate water before it gets to those low areas in your lawn, where it can then take a long time to dry out and can quickly become unusable in mosquito habitat and things like that. So this is just a simple graphic to kind of show you how you can evaluate your home and your own property, and just thinking about the impervious surfaces at your home, the which way the roofs are pitched, which way the driveway is sloped, how does your lawn slope down to the street, and where is water gonna collect, and how can you manipulate that water to get it to where you want it to go. And also keeping in mind at all times, where the water could leave the rain garden when it needs to overflow. So this is a good simple graphic of how you can do that in plan view. This is something we'll do typically on a site visit. We'll print out an aerial photo of your property and kind of help you identify some of these characteristics, topography and hydrology on your property, and start to diagram over the top of a aerial photo. And that kind of starts the design process. And so here's some examples. This is just a simple, small, maybe 150 to 200 square foot rain garden in the front yard. It's sloping consistently down towards the street there. The rain garden is easily 10 to 15 feet away from the foundation of the house, so you're not encouraging water intrusion, and it's just in a really nice spot and orientation visually to kind of help accent the house as well. And a good mix of plants in there. It's good to have a diversity of forbs, but not too many where it becomes difficult to manage and to determine what's a weed and what's not. So in here, it looks like we have some black-eyed Susan and Monarda and cup plant. Cup plant is one of those that can be a little aggressive, and so that's something we'll touch on here in a minute when we dive into plants more specifically. This is just a great example of how you can connect existing garden beds and connect it visually and functionally to your rain garden, and how it can accent the home. And then starting to get into conveyance. How is water going to get to your rain garden? This is a very common approach, connecting or disconnecting your downspouts and directing water to the rain garden via a buried drain tile, which can be either solid or perforated. Generally speaking, it's good to keep a solid piece of drain tile sloping at least 10 to 15 away from your house, and making sure that drain tile is also sloped at least 5% is good. It can be as little as 3%, but just to make sure that water keeps moving down slope to your rain garden, where it can then be emitted through either a pop-up emitter like in this photo, or some sort of grate. And so more on conveyance systems. These are some of the components that I just mentioned: the atrium grate, corrugated drain tile, pipe, and the catch drain, the catch basin that you would bury at grade underneath your downspout, and making sure that there's at least an inch or two gap in between. That's pretty critical, especially in the winter time. But it's not the only issue or option. There are lots of really interesting ways to convey water to your rain garden, and this is one of them: a dry creek bed. It's very, I think they're beautiful. It's another great way to incorporate more native plants into your landscape, and to have a feature that's a little bit more interactive. And this is one that I've seen in person, and it looks fantastic. It blends in really nicely with the surrounding landscape and the existing garden beds that they had on site. And you can see where the water enters the swale in the rain garden there on the bottom left, in these nice stone edgers. It's a really well put together system. And here's an example of how you can start to direct water off of impervious surfaces with that mounded area in the driveway that flows one direction into a dry creek bed, which is armored, we like to say, with those with that river rock, because when you start to get a lot of water moving at a high volume or higher speeds, it can start to cause some issues with erosion or washing out your mulch and just causing maintenance issues down the line, which Cameron will get into in a second. But adding that rock at the entry point is a way to prevent that from happening. And so here's more examples of how you can start to visualize the water movement from your downspouts to rain gardens on your property. And we'll start to get into the construction, which is, I think, the most fun. One thing that you should keep in mind as you're going through each of these steps is, what your soil conditions are like, and how quickly does water drain in your lawn or in your soil, because that's going to determine the size of the rain garden, the placement to some extent, and the different components that you're going to need to incorporate into the design. And so just some basic design principles for rain gardens. There's an inlet and an outlet. The inlet is always going to be a little bit higher than the outlet. So if that rain garden does fill up, which usually for residential settings is about 4 to 6 inches, 4 to 6 inch depth, up to 9 here. But that inlet should be at least a couple inches higher than the outlet, so that when the rain garden does overflow, it's overflowing away from the house towards some intentional area. It's oftentimes the street. Usually when we're thinking about sizing rain gardens, we do a little bit of modeling, and this is something that you can actually do at home. There's a great guide by Blue Thumb, the Blue Thumb Guide to Rain Gardens, that gives you a simple calculation on how to size your rain garden for the 1 inch rain event. You essentially, you measure all the impervious surfaces on your property, and you do a percolation test, which is that was shown in a few images back. You dig a hole that's maybe 8 inches wide by 8 inches deep. You fill it up, and you mark how quickly, over say a 1 hour period, how quickly that water infiltrates into the soil, and you do some simple division, and you can come up with a square footage for the rain garden. And once you have an idea of how big it needs to be and how deep it needs to be, then you can start to build it and kind of design as you go. In some ways, we have the overflow across the lawn here, the berm, which prevents water from flowing and overflowing in directions where you don't want it to. And you have the inlet, which is all measured with tools that you're going to need. I believe I have a couple of pictures here. Yep. A string level is just a really basic tool that you can use. It's just a bubble that hangs on a string that lets you measure simple slope over a certain distance. Depending on the scale of your rain garden, you can also, if you happen to own a 6 or 8 foot level, you can use that as well. Or we'll often go out to the field with a laser level, which I believe you're able to rent at some hardware stores. You can look into that. Or if you call us up and you're hoping to design and install a rain garden on site, we have these tools on hand in our office to help you with. So elevation is critical, and you definitely want to make sure that you're at the very least, and maybe most critically, that if your rain garden does overflow, it does not overflow towards the house. And so here's some more installation pictures, and measuring the elevation there on the berm. Here's a really nice example of a retaining wall at the inlet. And we'll start to just briefly go through soil prep here. So here's they have the rain garden marked out with just a simple garden hose to get a basic geometry. The rain garden, they've done some sizing and figured out it needs to be about 12 inches deep, starting to remove the sod, which you can do by hand as they're doing in this photo, or there is a tool that you can rent if you have a larger area, a power tool called a Sod Cutter that can make quicker work of that. And then they're using a soil amendment with compost. So typically, if you have heavier soils, clayey soils, those kinds of soils tend to hold on to water for a lot longer. And so loosening the soil, digging down to say 12 or even 2-foot depth, and incorporating some organic matter into the soil is going to increase. It's going to increase the water holding capacity, but it's also going to help that water drain and infiltrate faster. And it's going to be better for the plants in the long run as well. So here's the rough grading. One thing I forgot to mention, and this is critical, is that you want the bottom of the rain garden to be flat. And so you're encouraging that water to spread out and soak into the soil evenly. Putting the plants in. They have a variety of sizes there, variety of species. So here we have some of the components, the compost, which is, if you have sandy soils, it might also be a good situation to use compost, but not necessary in all cases. Usually adding a layer 2 to 3 inches of double shredded hardwood mulch to provide some weed suppression and moisture retention at the beginning to let those plants establish is important as well. Okay, so let's talk about plants. This is my favorite segment here. Cameron and Angie, just let me know how we're doing on time. I think we're doing okay, but
we are doing okay.
Okay, great. So right plants for the right place. This is a really good, it sounds simple, overly simple, but it's really, it proves itself to be all too true in a lot of cases. And so just these notes here on the bottom, it's really common to plant plants as either plugs, which is a little 2-inch pot essentially that comes in 6 packs or trays of 36 or 48, or 3 to 4 inch pots. It's generally a very cost-effective way to do it, and a lot of native plant nurseries around town sell plants in those sizes. Just pointing out some plants here. So here in the middle, we have, this is kind of a showstopper, and this is one that I personally really like, is Blue Wild Indigo, or Baptisia. It works really great. It has a really nice form. It's hardy. It's great for butterflies and bees. And then we also have a few different native cultivars here around the edge. It's hard to pick out all of these, but it looks like we have some heuchera. We have some geranium, or a cultivar of geranium. But a lot of, and when I say cultivar, it's a species that's selected for specific characteristics. Either its form, it can be kind of round and mounded, like a lot of these species in the foreground. It can be selected for a specific color of bloom, and it can be either a cultivar of a native or a non-native species. And you'll often hear people call cultivars of native species nativars, and we'll get into that in a little bit here. Save that for the end. But when you're going to select plants, it's good to keep in mind and to consider a mixture of both native grasses and forbs. So they each provide their own structural benefits and characteristics, and just interesting textures that can play off of each other. And it's always good to have some sort of graminoid or grass or sedge cover to help you with management and maintenance in the long term. They're really good for establishing permanent cover, whereas the forbs provide that aesthetic, those pops of color throughout the year, and the benefit to pollinators and birds. So just a few of those points that I just touched on. And planting and massing in drifts. So this is a good concept or rule of thumb to understand, but not necessarily follow to a T. So it can be really interesting to have these large swaths of one or two species to provide continuity and some intentionality to your rain garden. And you definitely want to avoid this where you have kind of a widespread random mix of grasses and sedges and individual species spread out all throughout the garden. But I think there is a happy medium in certain situations in the bottom of the rain garden, for example, that is subject to maybe a little bit more stress with short periods of flooding or inundation for as long as 24 to or even 48 hours, but also being subject to drying. So sedges can work really well in the bottom of the rain garden, where you can then plant a variety of wildflowers in between, but you definitely don't want to end up with a situation where your garden becomes illegible and it's hard to understand what's going on and it doesn't feel intentional anymore. So I think there's merits of both approaches, and there is a happy medium in between the two. And so these are just a few specific species that I'd like to call out. They're proven to be work really well in the residential scale, and they have great pollinator benefit, wildlife benefit. Wild geranium, and these are for shadier areas. Culver's root, columbine, fox sedge. Most of the sedges that you'll find out there, it's Carex is the genus, and then there's dozens and dozens of species out there that you can choose from. Here's part sun to shade. Blue lobelia is a great one. Turtlehead and bottle gentian are going to bloom later in the summer into the fall. And so it's good to select species that provide benefits to pollinators throughout the year. So starting in early spring all the way through late fall. Purple coneflower and butterfly weed are, in my opinion, they're must-haves. I think they're really great. Species both, they're both beautiful, and butterflies love them, and bees as well. Black-eyed Susan, anise hyssop, all these are powerhouses for native bees and butterflies. And prairie dropseed is a very, very dynamic native grass that can provide really great structure, particularly along the edges. It tends to have this really nice arching, kind of rounded, neat form that can provide an edge and a really intentional look to the border of your rain garden. And here's some more late season bloomers: azure aster, prairie blazing star, meadow blazing star. Carl Forster is a common one, and that's a cultivar of a non-native reed grass. Blue flag iris. Pussy toes as a nice little ground cover. It's actually being used as what's being marketed as living mulch. So using short species that colonize over time to provide cover in the lowest layer of your planting, so you don't constantly have to be mulching every year. And here we have some really nice examples of using stone and hardscaping in a native planting, which is a good solution when you're dealing with more drastic changes in grade. which brings me to the last segment here, equipment. Now is a lot of contractors, there are a lot of contractors out there who are able to do this work and do it really well. But if you're interested in doing the work yourself, these are some of the tools to keep in mind and keep an eye out for at your local hardware store to help you make quicker work of some of the preparation and installation. So this is the Sod Cutter that I mentioned that you can use for removing sod over a larger area in your yard. The prices are going to vary quite a bit, and keep in mind that this is a very heavy piece of machinery. So you might need a larger vehicle to haul it around unless you're able to get it delivered to you. A tiller can also be very useful for similar applications. And some of these components that are going to be available at most hardware stores, certainly big box stores, the perforated and solid drain tile, these different emitters that you can use to allow rain or stormwater to enter your garden. Fabric, which it can be used in certain situations. The dry swales or rock gardens that I mentioned, that's where a fabric is going to be really useful for you. And then thinking about borders and edging. And there are lots of options out there, almost endless options. Plastic or vinyl are very common, steel and aluminum, and brick pavers or stone. A trencher is going to be useful for setting that. But just a thing to keep in mind here is that it's important that you keep, when you're installing your edging, to always keep it at grade to allow water to enter the garden and leave it at grade, and not letting it sit up too high. But here's some really great examples of that natural stone edging that can complement your house well. And the prices again are going to vary quite a bit, but it's just good to keep in mind what your priorities are, and you know what you want your rain garden to how you want it to perform, and how both aesthetically in your landscape and also functionally from a water quality perspective. Okay, and just quickly, I'll fly through compost, mulch, and plants. A lot of these soil amendments and mulch are going to be available in bulk from a variety of vendors, and we have a contractor list that I'm sure we'd be happy to send out, so you can source some of these materials. It's typically sold by the cubic yard or ton for rock specifically. And likewise for mulch. One thing to keep in mind now is that I'm sure you've heard are the concern with jumping worms. It's a non-native earthworm from Asia. It's a soil engineer, so it changes both the structural and the chemical composition of the soil, and can be really detrimental for native ecosystems. And they move around in mulch and soil. And so it's good to avoid sharing plants with family members and neighbors, but also pay attention to where your mulch and your soil is coming from, making sure that it's heat treated and that the vendor you're getting it from is aware of the issue and assures you that their mulch and soil is heat treated to kill both the living worms but also the eggs that can lay dormant over winter. And when I recommended double shredded hardwood mulch, just a note on that, it's good to use double shredded hardwood mulch as opposed to say a wood chip. For the reason I mentioned earlier, that when you get water flowing into your rain garden, and when you get these larger volumes of water pooling in your garden, the mulch has a tendency to pop up and float and move around. And so the double shredded hardwood mulch kind of locks together a little bit better and stays in place. And for native plants, I mentioned this briefly, you can look at either native plugs, which will be around 150 a piece, and they're sold in 6-packs or trays of 36. 4-inch pots, just to size up. Some species are going to be available only in 3 to 4-inch pots. Or if you're hoping to have a more immediate result in terms of plants reaching maturity or going in at a more mature size, 1-gallon pots can be a good option for you as well. Generally going to be a little bit more expensive, but it can be a good option. And just make sure there's lots of space in your vehicle. It fills up quick. And this is a snapshot of some resources that we'd be happy to send out later on, native plant nurseries around town. And we can also share some information on where you can source mulch and soil. With that, toss it over to Cameron.
While we're waiting for Cameron to get started, does anybody have questions about rain garden design that you want to ask Brett about before we hop into maintenance? You can also feel free to use the chat function anytime you want to, and we'll try to answer stuff out loud or in the chat as we're going. You just told it so well, Brett. Everybody knew exactly what you were talking about.
Hi there, I've got a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How susceptible are these natives to just being eaten by our woodland friends?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is, well, it depends, but I would say if you really, it's a good idea to protect your investment and invest in some fencing right at the beginning, deer rabbit fencing. I've had several plantings that have been completely chomped by rabbits and deer, and it's never fun when that happens. You can select plants that are resistant to both deer and rabbit browse, and actually Prairie Moon Nursery has a lot of really good information on that, specific plants that you can choose to avoid damage from rabbits, deer, and other pests. But it is good to put up some temporary fencing at the beginning, just to give the plants a chance to establish, at least for the first several weeks.
All right, well, I can get into the maintenance side of things if we're ready for that, and there should be plenty of time for questions at the end as well if you're still letting all of the previous information kind of percolate. So maintenance of rain gardens, some of it is pretty typical to maintenance of any garden, and then some of it is unique for rain gardens, either because of their some of the unique design features, or if you're just unfamiliar with native plants, some of it can be a little bit unique. So I'm going to go through some of these topics here. Yeah, sometimes people are buying a new house and they inherit a yard and it has a rain garden, and they maybe are not even really sure what it is. Sometimes people have just put in a rain garden and want to know how to give it its best shot. So I'm not sure where people are at, but we'll try and cover kind of the different perspectives that you can come in with. If this will let me, there we go. So the way the slides are set up is kind of a timeline or a time of year advancement of what you might be doing at different times of the year. So starting off in early spring, a lot of times what we do, or what we recommend doing, is not to do the clean out of this nest vegetation in the fall, rather to leave that, as it can provide aesthetic interest. It can provide habitat for pollinators and food sources, and it can also protect the plants from frost, things like that. So we actually, our office, when we do maintenance, we tend to try and leave the clean out for the spring and let stuff kind of be in the fall. So In early spring, you can cut back on the winter stand. What I've been seeing more recently is pollinator groups are recommending until there's been some consistent 50-degree days, because that can be how long it takes for all of last year's pollinators to come out of the old growth that they've been overwintering in. So if you don't wait for them to get out there super early, you might be throwing away your last year's worth of pollinators for your own yard. Inlet clean out, like Brett was saying, there's some design pieces of rain gardens that are unique and not something that you see just in regular plantings. So this inlet clean out is something that happens in the spring for sure, and then possibly depending on how quickly your inlet fills up, that how much of a load it actually receives. It can be done at another point in the year as well. So you can see in these examples a couple different examples of inlet designs. So the one to the left is a turf or a sod inlet. So the way that one works is you can see it's a curb cut rain garden, and the kind of all the sediment and debris enters through this grass, which can kind of help filter out some of the solid particles. And eventually when these start to fill up, and the grass will still kind of grow through, but eventually if the sod is too tall, you need to cut that, go down a little bit, and either do some seed or do some new sod so that there's room for that sediment to pile up again. So that's what's going on in the picture on the left. You can also see that there's some debris left on the street. So it's good to scrape that up. That's also a good indication that maybe it's time to excavate that sod so that the water doesn't pond in the street and leave that debris there. The image to the right is what we call it's a Raingarden structure. These are my favorite type of inlet to maintain because of just the ease of it. They're these boxes that the water will enter, filter through a screen in the back, and then it drops out most of the larger particles, leaves, things like that. And they're super easy to clean out. So I prefer those a lot. Rock inlets are another option that Brett was showing a few pictures of. They definitely function very well as inlets. They collect that sediment as well and prevent scour, which can or sediment plumes pushing into your garden and harming your plants at the base. They're just quite a bit trickier to clean out. So it's okay if you have one. It's still possible to do. It just is a little bit more. It takes a little bit more time. You essentially have to kind of excavate all of the rock and kind of clean it out and reposition everything so that you're ensuring that you're still creating that space in the rock for all of the sediment to collect so that it doesn't start pushing into your garden. So this is really the most unique part of maintenance to rain gardens are these inlet structures, especially because they can differ. Depending on when these gardens have been designed and installed, you can see different designs, or depending on the person who designed them, they might have different preferences. I've seen, there's boxes that can be kind of under the ground, like under the grade surface, that need to be cleaned out if the water is entering kind of beneath the garden instead of coming in from the surface. So there's different things to look for if you're walking into a garden for the first time. You can kind of identify those different design aspects, and that'll let you know what's needed to maintain the inlet, which is really important. Yep, here's another example of the Raingarden inlet. So that's another thing that we call, these are pre-treatment areas, pre-treatment chambers. So you can see this is another curb cut rain garden with the Raingarden. So sometimes in the fall, as the leaves are falling, you might want to clear off the top a little bit more regularly so that water still enters the practice normally as it should through that grate. It should be pretty easy to kind of just pop those open, scrape it out with a shovel. We recommend just disposing of the debris rather than composting it, just due to, especially for street runoff. It's less important if you're talking about kind of overland runoff or rain gutter, but when it's coming from the street, sometimes we recommend not composting that just because it can contain higher levels of pollutants specific to car kind of debris, if that's I could say it, like brake components and things like that wash into that maybe you don't want to mix up into your compost. So just throw it away if you're coming from a street like that. And then moving into kind of vegetative maintenance. Some of this is for early gardens that haven't had a chance to maybe fill out yet. Kind of what Brett was saying, the ideal, what you want to see with an established garden is that it's very full of these native intended plants, so that the weed pressure is really non-existent or low. But especially when it's earlier on in a practice, if the plants are smaller, you want to make sure that you're checking up on the edging, you're adding mulch when you need it, especially with this turf grass pressure. So early spring is a great time to, before the natives are really full on growing, it's a great time to address any kind of turf encroachment and pressure. Add some mulch if it looks like it's needed. Check your edging. Yeah, mulching, like I said, that's another good one to do in the spring, because then the native plants haven't emerged yet, so you're not having kind of work around them. It's just easier. You can still add mulch later in the year. You just have to, it goes a little bit slower. You just have to kind of spread it out a little bit more carefully and make sure you're not burying anything. What I've heard recommended mulch wise is definitely the shredded or double shredded hardwood mulch. This can help with flotation and repositioning of mulch if you just use kind of like the big chips. That's something that we'll see pretty frequently. If you use the kind of the big chip mulch, it's more likely to float during a rain event and get kind of repositioned and cover plants and things like that on the bottom. So shredded hardwood mulch is a good option for that from a maintenance perspective, because then it doesn't move around as much. Spring is another great time of year to look at if you have a more established garden. And this is kind of also typical garden. Sometimes rain gardens, the plants will grow. The plants that are closest to where a lot of the nutrients are coming in kind of can like mega grow. I've seen that before. So those are good ones to kind of with any garden. If you see a plant that's getting really big and kind of outgrowing either aesthetically or functionally with other plants around it, those are great ones to divide and move around in your garden or trade with neighbors. I've seen plant swaps, set up on Nextdoor all the time. It's pretty, I like those. Those are pretty fun to see. Yeah, best done not in the heat of the year, so in the spring. So you want to dig up the whole plant and try and remember that, especially with these native plants, the root systems can be really big. So try and get the whole thing so that you're not you're giving it its best chance at survival later. And then you can kind of pick it apart carefully by hand, so that you're doing the least damage to the different root systems that are going on. And then you can, replant them, give them to some family members, add them to areas that are more bare. I think I get into that a little bit later here. Just had a question about grazing damage for deer and rabbits. That's definitely something, especially if you're out in rural areas. I don't know, my parents have a lot of grazing in there and just in Maplewood, so maybe it's not just rural areas. But yeah, so it's especially with newer plants, and sometimes there's certain plants that they like to eat more. So that is something that you want to be aware of and look up solutions for. You can do cages and different physical kind of barriers or protections. I know people have had luck with different repellents that you just kind of put around the outside of the garden. So definitely different options depending on what you're hoping to do. Other maintenance tips for the spring before the plants have really grown so much that it's hard to weave them in. So with taller plants that are going to get really tall and you kind of want to hold, maybe you want them to hold their shape, you can get these different kind of meshes or baskets that they'll then kind of grow through, and then they'll kind of keep their shape depending on if you want them to look that way aesthetically. I think that you can do staking as well. That's an option to kind of help support them and keep their blooms tall if that's what you're hoping for aesthetically, or if you're trying to make sure that they don't fall over on top of all your other plants. And then it always comes before you know it, weeding. That it starts right away in the early summer. They start growing right away, so you want to make sure that you're out there early on, so that they don't go to seed and drop the seed so quickly that then you have to worry about them next year. So you can see an example. It looks like this picture is an example of, you can see where the original design or the original edge used to be, and that turf really can encroach. That's what's great about what Brett was saying about the different like hard edging, hard borders. Because the better border you have, the less you have to worry about that turf encroachment, which is sometimes one of the trickier weeds to tackle because it gets so thick and difficult. So right away in the summer, you'll probably have to start weeding, remulching, if there's specific areas that you know that you can target. There's the pictures. This is also what Brett was saying, a design aspect. If you are trying to kind of design your garden from the start, something you can do to help yourself later on is to limit the number of species to some extent and then plant them in clusters so that they're easily identifiable later on when they're full grown. So you're not always questioning which plant is which and what needs to be there and what shouldn't be there. It's a good practice to do from a design standpoint for maintenance. And then, yeah, still kind of early on in the summer before it gets too hot, it's a good opportunity to see what's all come up and where there might be bare patches where maybe the plants haven't come back. Might be good to replant or get some split plants, get some new plants where they haven't filled out this year. That's a good thing to do in the early summer. Once it starts getting warm, it's not a great planting time. It gets very stressful for plants. So that's about when you want to look at that. Watering, for newer gardens especially, that's when they need help with watering. What Angie was saying about native plants is true later on in their life. When they're bigger and more established, they don't need watering. That's part of what's great about them. But when they're early planting or younger gardens, you want to make sure you're helping out with watering so that you're protecting your investment, you're giving the plants what they need to survive. And then weeding goes all throughout the summer. There's different weeds come up at different times. Yeah, depending on if you're inheriting an old garden that might have some established weed seed just in the dirt, and it might take a few years to kind of get a hold of whatever's coming up. Also, if there's just annual weeds that are, repopulating by seed, there's always a chance if your garden isn't full, if your mulch isn't super thick, annuals can take seed whenever, and they come up at different times of the year. There's like different species that you see at different times. So anyone who has a garden knows that you can kind of weed all the time. And then as you're getting later into the season, that's another time that you can look at dividing. Irises, lilies, or peonies is a good time of year to divide those, is actually in the fall rather than the spring. And then it's also a time that you can mark in your garden or remind yourself which plants, other plants might need to be split that you want to get to in the spring instead. Fall is also a great time to collect any of the seed that's been produced by the natives as they've senesced, and maybe you want to use the seed in your yard later on. A good tip to know if the seed is fully ready is they should be hard. If you try and pinch them, like if they're soft, they're probably not fully developed yet. So you can, be patient with the collecting the seed in the fall, make sure that it's completely gone through its cycle. And then circling back to what we said in the beginning, we usually recommend leaving your senesced veg over the winter rather than cleaning it out right in the fall. It provides pollinator habitat, food source, and just aesthetic interest in your yard. It can be cool to see some of those tall grasses, poking up through the snow. So that's usually what we recommend for folks, but it's also if it's your preference to clean it out, that's fine too. And if it is a new grain garden, or maybe you did your planting in the fall, watering in the fall is also something that you'll see people doing, just to make sure that you're keeping the natives surviving through their whole growing season, their whole growth cycle, so that they come back next year. Yeah, bunny browsing. So they definitely like to eat bark. So there's other things that you need to do to address rabbit browse. So that's, you know, again, physical barriers or relocation is an option if you feel the need. So, and then late winter, early spring is also the best time of year if you have shrubs or trees in your design. That's when you want to do maintenance for those. I think it's best for the health of whatever the woody species is in your planting. So yeah, pruning can be used to for aesthetics to kind of maintain the size and shape, or it can be healthy for the tree or shrub as well to remove dead branches. It encourages new growth, things like that. And pruning is definitely something, there's definitely some techniques you want to make sure that you understand, angles that you want to do, distance between the plant and timing, because you don't want to accidentally kill your shrub by trying to help it out and pruning it at the wrong time of year or too close or things like that. So you definitely want to make sure you fully understand how to prune before you go out there with a loppers and go to town on something. And then, yeah, questions about maintenance, because there's many different kinds of weeds, and they all have different management strategies, and people have all kinds of awesome tricks and tips. So definitely reach out to people to come look at what's in your yard, and they might know exactly the best way to manage something. So use local knowledge, master gardeners, the U of M extension, local nurseries, the Washington Conservation District, the DNR, people like that. Pictures can be good if you're close up enough, and make sure you're not just standing back and taking a picture of the whole thing, because it can be hard to ID plants if you're too far away. And then there's also all kinds of different books and publications to help you ID plants. Plant identification is, my understanding is, it's a kind of a lifelong sport. So it's something that you can continually add to you can continually learn new ID for plants, native and weeds. So there's lots of resources out there. And that is the end of maintenance. And then Angie, I think you're picking up this end portion here.
I am indeed. Do you just want to keep your slide up, since I think it's just this and one other slide?
Yeah.
And let's see, where did I go? There I am. Okay, I'm back floating in the St. Croix River. So I think that Brett and Cameron probably already mentioned our site visits, but I will send out an email to everybody tomorrow morning that will have a link to our site visit sign-up form. Anybody who lives in Washington County can have a site visit, whether you have an urban property, a farm, a business, and it typically lasts about an hour. Somebody can come out and walk around and, you know, discuss options. If you're looking to put in a rain garden, where would the rain garden best be? Or maybe they might say, actually your yard's not really well suited for a rain garden. Here's something else you could do instead. If you live in a different county and you are looking for assistance, there are usually similar programs through soil and water conservation districts in the other counties. And I think in a moment on the next slide, it has the contact information for those people. But I did want to mention that the local watershed districts offer cost share grants for rain gardens, and it just kind of varies from one watershed to the next what that entails. In some places, it's just a simple $500 plant grant. You go buy your plants, and that's that. In some of the watershed districts, they have priority areas, and you can potentially qualify for a larger grant if you're building a rain garden in one of those areas. Our website, the Washington Conservation District, has a whole bunch of resources from previous workshops. We have some maintenance guidance on the Adopt a Rain portion of our website. And then Blue Thumb is just an all-around really great one-stop shop for everything rain garden. There's a plant selector tool. There's links to local retailers. There's all sorts of other workshops. Okay, go for it, Cameron. All right, so if you are in Washington County, we have 8 different watershed management organizations. And these are all formed around the area that where the water all flows to one point. So for example, in the south end of the county, that, you know, pinkish area, that's the South Washington Watershed District, and all the water is pretty much going down either to the St. Croix or the Mississippi River. Whereas that middle one, the Browns Creek Watershed District, the dark green color, that's all channeling in towards the Browns Creek and then out towards the St. Croix River. So like I said, each of these areas has a slightly different cost share program. All right, I think I'll do that. That'll be my next slide, right? So this is where I was alluding to other counties. I'll leave this up while we're answering questions, because if you are in Anoka, Chisago, Isanti, or Pine counties, I have the contact information for the person that you should reach out to. In Washington County, since we're bigger and more populated, we actually have several staff people in the office who do site visits. So really just using that site visit form is probably the best way to get a hold of or schedule a site visit. But I did include contact information for Cameron, Brett, and I as well. And then if you are somewhere else, you're a different county that I didn't list on here, just send me an email and I can probably direct you to the right person, or you know, hit forward and find somebody who can help you wherever it is that you live. Okay, so questions. Anybody have questions for the three of us? I can hear a happy little bird tweeting right outside my window. It's like toot tweet, toot tweet, toot tweet.
I should also just add that depending on where you are, it can be kind of a fun and a fun idea to get out and look at some of the county or city parks in your area, or go to the Minnesota DNR's website and start to just do a little bit of research into the scientific and natural area program. It can be a really good idea to just start to learn more about plants and the plants that grow locally in the landscape around you, and it can kind of start to inform, you know, what plants and what design you'd want for your home. And so it's kind of a way to stitch together the landscape in a more I think an interesting way and a beneficial way. So
Okay. Quiet crowd tonight, huh? Everybody feeling motivated, excited to get out and get gardening? Yeah. All right. Well, if there are no questions, you know how to get a hold of us. And like I said, I'll send a follow-up email. And we set you free now. We set you free to go forth and go garden and enjoy your Tuesday. Is it Tuesday? It's Tuesday. Go forth and enjoy your Tuesday.
looks like we do have one question in the chat here.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, cypress wood mulch. Yes, that would work. Cedar hardwood mulch is also another good option, sustainable option. But yes, cypress mulch is commonly available.
All right.
I have a question.
Oh.
Just, I want to thank you all for this meeting. It was really informational. And Brett, you came to our property last year and you sent me the, approximate cost and everything. Thank you. My question is, I was not able to apply for a grant last year, and I'm wondering what are the, time, when should I do it this year? Probably it will be for the next one for 2022, right? What are the, data line or date line or?
Yeah, why don't you and I reconnect, and
Okay.
we can take a look at the plan that we sent over last year. It could have been it was towards the end of the summer or fall, and sometimes the watershed districts run low on their cost share funding for the year. But I think now would be a really great time to revisit that and submit an application. So
I'll send you an email then. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And in case people are wondering, typically the cost share programs operate on a rolling monthly cycle. So they're looking at the cost share applications once a month during the board meetings. It's not like You know, there's no hard deadline usually on where you can apply for, when you can apply for grant funds. It's just that they do eventually run out. Yeah, Anne, you had a question.
Yeah, do the packages, you know, we didn't buy bulk. How do we know if it's heat treated or not? That's like the mulch stuff. Is it usually labeled on the package or whatever?
Typically, no, that's something you'd have to ask specifically from the vendor or even the manufacturer. You might have to do a little digging.
Okay.
This is a new issue with the jumping worms. I guess the University of Minnesota is known that they've been here in the state for quite some time, the last 10 years or so, but we're now starting to see that they're becoming far more widespread. So it's likely that most manufacturers and vendors haven't really adjusted or responded to the issue just yet. So it's good to kind of start to press and do your own research there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Also about those jumping worms, if I'll buy a drop ship from the people who, you know, cut the trees and make it right away, is it safe? Well, I would assume it would, right? Because it's just a tree that was mulched right away. What do you think?
That's actually a great solution. Yeah, I've heard more and more people doing that. If you know of some tree removal happening around your neighborhood, that could be a good way to source your mulch directly. You would want to be aware of some other pests that could be present, you know, fungus and other insects, ash borer, right? So you don't want to be moving it across county lines or
gee.
Yeah.
Tricky too, right? Not easy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, anything else? Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. It was fun to see your smiling faces. Yeah. All righty, good night then.
Thank you.